So good evening, everybody. My name is David Levi-Faur, and we are now in another series of another seminar in the series on trust and regulation of the TiGRE project. Today with us, Professor Bernice L. Hausman, and she will talk about vaccination controversies, trust then and now. Bernice has a background in literature and movement studies, but she has been researching medicine and culture since the early 90s. She writes specifically on medical controversies in the public sphere. Her research areas include medical technology, ideas about gender, breastfeeding, infant feeding, debate, HIV transmission, and of course, vaccination. Bernice, we are glad to have you with us, and I'm looking forward for your presentation. Thank you very much for doing this for us. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. This is a great opportunity. So I'm going to share my screen. I have some slides.
Yeah.
And does that work for everybody?
Yes, it does.
Fabulous.
Excellent.
So, let me just coordinate myself here. I actually have a sort of a written talk. I have to tell you all that, you know, I'm an administrator. Okay, so let me make sure this is going to go forward. Where's my cursor? There we go. I'm an administrator, and so I don't get a chance as much as I used to really kind of think about things that I want to know about. And I really, really have enjoyed, yesterday I just spent, the day before and yesterday I just spent a lot of time thinking about this talk and what I wanted to say. And was one of the most pleasurable 2 days I've had in a very long time. On this slide, you can see the central question that I asked in my book, Anti-Vax, as well as some of my more general findings. Overall, in the book, I argue that our perception of vaccination dissent is skewed by incomplete news reporting and a reliance on the repudiated Wakefield study as a way of understanding parental concerns about vaccines. To reframe the controversy, I explore a variety of cultural sources to show that concerns about facts, for example, how we trust them, medicalization, and apocalypse are echoed in discourses of vaccine skepticism. In other words, I argue that vaccine hesitancy is related to other prominent trends in contemporary culture. These trends are not isolated to wackos, idiots, or people who are particularly gullible to internet misinformation. The purpose of the book then is to illuminate these trends so as to reorient the controversy away from stalemate, vitriolic accusation, and inflammatory charges toward a more productive exchange about responsibility, population, and individual health, and how we live with one another. So history suggests persistent themes in vaccination dissent: contamination and corruption, illness as the result of vaccination, bodily autonomy, personal and familial authority over health decisions and health experience. News reporting on vaccination in the United States used to be much more sympathetic to vaccine concerns and more well-rounded. It was not just about parents. It became more inflammatory and accusatory in tone after the turn of the 21st century. Between 2000 and 2010, news reporting consolidated around the imago of the misinformed parent, usually a mother, as an anti-vaxxer, especially in the years after the 2004 Institute of Medicine report that did not find connections between vaccines and autism, after the culture wars concerning the HPV vaccine Gardasil and girl sexuality. That was HPV, Gardasil was approved in the United States in 2006. And after the 2009 omnibus autism proceeding, which was a legal proceeding of the vaccine court that decided that, did not find a connection between vaccines and autism. So those three things, I argue, kind of really consolidated a kind of a hardened perception of vaccine dissenting parents, especially, as irrational, gullible, and spreading misinformation. So in Anti-Vax, I address these issues by looking at the history of the modern fact, the question of vaccine denialism, zombie fiction and how it represents mistrust of bureaucratic government's commitments to its own citizens, a qualitative study of vaccine dissenting and accepting parents, and modernity and its socio-political systems as a context for vaccine dissent. So this slide kind of goes down the rabbit hole of existential questioning that starts with the insight that the relationship of nature to culture is central to vaccine dissent. Vaccines, of course, are the products of cultural activity, the making of things in laboratories, the testing of those things on animals and humans, the naming and licensing and approving and recommending of those things for injection into humans and animals in order to alleviate the burden of illness on individuals and societies. Vaccines represent bacteriology and germ theory at work, and they are heralded as preventing millions of cases of disease and keeping millions of people from death from infectious disease. As scientific products, vaccines are also cultural products. They exist as nature-culture hybrids, in the language of French sociologist Bruno Latour. Thus, one problem of vaccination for vaccine skeptics is the problem of the natural body in human groups. How to best protect, nurture, support, feed, tend to, and understand the natural body is a consistent theme of the interviews that my research group conducted with both vaccinating and non-vaccinating families. Bodies in groups is a constant focus. Children's bodies in school and in families, individual bodies in communities. What to do with sick bodies is another theme: how to feed sick bodies, support sick bodies, deal with sick bodies, both in the context of families and in larger groups. The question underlying all of this is the body natural? Another version of the concern might be articulated in this way: how do natural infants become members of human communities? One answer is that we vaccinate them. For the public health officials that we interviewed, excuse me, being vaccinated allows one to be in groups. And for non-vaccinating families my research group has spoken with, being ill requires withdrawal from communities and support for the body. Taking medication to allow one back into the group while sick was commented on critically by some of these families, as well as other families that vaccinated. Indeed, vaccination allows for the limitless circulation of people and goods within modern societies. Foucault has discussed this issue. Even popular writers comment on the fact that mothers who work rely on vaccines to allow them to remain in the workforce because they don't have to stay at home to tend sick children. So vaccination thus addresses the problem of humans in groups, but it also troubles it. Vaccines are things that enable living in communities but represent their existential limits. To live safely in the human community, one injects oneself with something that is foreign, a piece of the other, to prevent illness. This is the pro-vaccine explanation. But from the other view, to live safely on Earth, one lives in consonance with other living beings, even microbes, and trains one's body to live with them, supporting the body when necessary and retreating from one's neighbors as needed. Vaccinations, in this view, disrupt natural relationships of humans on Earth and in groups, artificially enabling more group interactions than is healthy. So these are observations that I've made by reading newspapers and paying attention to public discourses about COVID vaccines and the impact of protests against police violence last year. So I'm making a shift here. I've just talked about some of the major findings of my book and the sort of thinking that that really kind of motivated that book. And I can talk more about my conclusions there. And especially I'd love to talk to you about zombie novels in the Q&A. But I've been, spending a lot of time this year just trying to pay attention to what's going on in public discourse. And you can imagine there's a lot of public discourse about COVID and vaccines. So one of the things that I noticed was that in spring 2020, there was sort of news reporting focused both on misinformation and these concerns that people would not take COVID vaccines. What's interesting, of course, there were no COVID vaccines at the time. So there was this kind of prognosticating kind of fears about those other people who would not be vaccinated and how they might endanger us. And it was an interesting kind of configuration of the sort of us-them polarization. It's very, very prominent in United States culture right now. Spring and summer protests against state authority to enforce public health measures like masks, stay-at-home regulations, restrictions on economic activity. Those protests involved some anti-vax demonstrators. Late spring and summer protests against the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor in the United States, in addition to emerging data on health disparities concerning COVID morbidity and mortality in communities of color, affected approaches to vaccine dissent. So I have this real significant kind of growing set of ideas about how the racial protests and this growing concern about disparities have transformed the way we frame our understanding of vaccine dissent. And I'm going to sort of explore that a little more as the talk goes on. Part of that response is there are emerging responses from public health and sort of professional medicine that legitimate minority distrust in vaccines due to histories of medical exploitation and discrimination. So in the past 6 months, for example, there have been more public discussion of the effect of the Tuskegee syphilis experiment and how it has affected African-American trust in medicine than I have ever seen previously in public context. And that has both positive and negative impacts, as I hope we'll discuss. So one of the things that has happened out of all of this, I would argue, is that a confidence framework has partly replaced the misinformation framework concerning vaccine dissent. This shift from misinformation to confidence is positive in my view. It shifts responsibility to public health and the state to inculcate trust rather than blame others for the vulnerability of vaccination programs. And yet, lingering concerns about misinformation and wrong belief as primary drivers of vaccination dissent percolate throughout the news media and public health guidance. So one of the questions I have is, why do we focus so much on wrong belief? In the context of low availability of vaccines, why focus on belief at all? Why talk about it? Why emphasize it as a primary problem when the logistical constraints of getting a vaccine are far more significant in the current context? Now, I want to make it clear, I'm not arguing that there is no misinformation. Indeed, there is evidence of actual disinformation campaigns about COVID-19 vaccines. So the Center for Countering Digital Hate, which is a London-based group, published a report called the Anti-Vax Playbook. You can find this online, that outlines efforts by some of the most vocal vaccine dissenters to coordinate messaging against COVID-19 vaccines around what they call the master narrative. 3 components to this master narrative are on the slide. COVID is not dangerous, the vaccine is dangerous, and vaccine advocates cannot be trusted. So the idea that sort of the primary players in COVID, in vaccine dissent on the internet and in public culture, at least in the United States, people like Barbara Lowy-Fisher, who runs the National Vaccine Information Center, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who is a very significant vaccine dissenting voice, and Del Bigtree and others, that they are coordinating messaging around. The argument of this report is that they're actually coordinating messaging to sow distrust in COVID vaccines. So I think that coordination to me is very worrisome. However, the focus, I would argue that the focus on misinformation has downsides. It amplifies political polarization that is already socially damaging. It reflects modernity's faith in science and rationality, rejecting modernity's alternate emphasis on subjectivity and variability. It reflects increasing lack of tolerance for non-standard beliefs, and it establishes education and the promotion of scientific literacy as answers to the problem of vaccine refusal. And I think those are, what's interesting is that the misinformation sort of frame has this kind of obvious solution that has basically been debunked as not being very successful in changing anybody's mind. So there's a kind of an internal problem to this framing of misinformation. So I want to spend the last few minutes of this talk to discuss two themes in current vaccine dissent. One is a theme that is historically present within vaccine dissent. It concerns about corruption, and it goes back all the way through smallpox. And the other is a theme that is used to respond to vaccine misinformation, the idea of inoculation against misinformation. And the reason I've chosen these two themes is because as metaphors, they collapse sort of the two registers in which they that they refer to. They demonstrate how vaccine concerns and responses to them sort of collapse biological and social registers. And I think analyzing that crossing and analyzing how that crossing operates will give us clues as to how and why vaccine regimes are vulnerable. So corruption analogizes and links physical contamination and unethical relationships. There are long-standing fears about vaccines being corrupted by contamination. So some examples: smallpox vaccine wounds were typically corrupted by tetanus, syphilis, or erysipelas, all of which are bacterial diseases that could be sort of either. So syphilis was, they used to do this thing with smallpox where they would keep, before they figured out how to actually dry the virus and then reactivate it, right? Or that they were using the vaccinia virus, they would keep it alive by what they called arm-to-arm transmission. And there's a famous story of bringing the smallpox vaccine to the Americas, where a group of orphaned boys are on a boat that's sailing to the Americas. This was from Spain, I believe. And they kept the arm-to-arm, they kept the material alive by passing the virus from the arms of the boys, so that when it got to the Americas, there was still live virus that could be used for vaccination. Those wounds could be, so they could also pass syphilis, in that if somebody was infected with syphilis, that would also pass in that particular way of using the human lymph for smallpox vaccine. And then the tetanus could infect the wounds. Tetanus could also infect the vaccine itself. There was a famous case in 1902 of tetanus, an outbreak in Camden, New Jersey, right outside of Philadelphia, during a smallpox outbreak. And there was an effort to determine whether it was the vaccine itself that was causing the tetanus or whether it was poor wound care. But so this was a known problem, this sort of contamination of either the vaccine site or the vaccine itself. Vaccines, of course, can be corrupted by dirt, or the perception is they can be corrupted by dirt, microbes, so other microbes like tetanus, fetal DNA and tissues. This is another concern, right? That vaccines are developed by utilizing fetal cell lines that are developed from elective aborted fetal tissue from the 1970s. There are two ways in which this tissue is used in the development of vaccines. One is to grow the virus for those vaccines that use the virus as itself either attenuated or in some way killed in the vaccine. The other way is that the fetal tissue cells, right, the cell lines derived from fetal tissues are utilized as tests for the vaccine in some way. And there are websites, for example, that will show you the COVID vaccines, current COVID vaccines, and whether or not they use fetal tissues or not. You may know that there was also an issue in Indonesia before the COVID vaccine that they're utilizing were approved, to determine whether or not any pork products were used in the vaccine. And Indonesia is the largest Muslim country, the country with the largest Muslim population in the world. And they, of course, needed to know before they disseminated the vaccine whether or not observant Muslims were going to reject it because of the use of whether there was use of pork products in that. They're animal DNA, animal viruses. So many vaccines are developed utilizing tissue cultures that are derived from animal cells. So monkey kidney cells are often utilized. There's the famous concern about SV40, which is a simian virus that was found to have contaminated polio vaccine in the I think it was the 60s, and many of us who were vaccinated against polio in the 1960s, I'm one of those people, probably have SV40 in our bodies in some way. And then there are the concerns with preservatives like thimerosal and adjuvants like aluminum. So all of those can be understood as corrupting influences on vaccines. And then, so that's the fears of biological corruption are long-standing, and they continue with vaccines. Vaccine development, production, regulation, and approval can be corrupted also. So for example, in the United States, pharmaceutical companies are legally immune from vaccine injury tort liability. So that demonstrates its corrupt relations with the government. Vaccine development makes money for pharmaceutical companies, and greed, of course, is a well-known corrupting influence that we look out for in our social relationships. The government, scientific discovery, and pharmaceutical companies are too close to one another to trust government vaccine safety regulations. And then, of course, medical exploitation and discrimination against racial and ethnic minorities is another example of corruption. So the perceived medical danger of vaccines is based in part, if you're looking at this through the corruption theme, on both biological corruption and a form of political corruption. Corruption as a metaphor mixes these registers, the biological and the socio-political, and vaccines as corrupted products cannot be separated in this view from their corrupted origins, ingredients, or consequences. So the second metaphor I want to look at is this notion of inoculating against misinformation. And this is a quotation from the anti-vax playbook. This, in a section for practitioners, they talk about inoculating their patients and clients against misinformation. So again, inoculation against misinformation is obviously a metaphor. This viral metaphor analogizes information circulation with viral contagion. The metaphoric usage matches our existing use of the term computer viruses, which again is a metaphor. And the metaphor connects viruses and beliefs as things that circulate and need to be controlled or eradicated because of their danger to health. And so the idea, and then the other thing I would want to say about this is that the idea of inoculating against a false belief can be experienced as an assault on free speech, personal choice, or individual liberty, right? The notion that you're going to try and inoculate somebody against a set of beliefs is a way of restricting their maybe not their access, but restricting the idea that it's their free choice to determine whether or not they want to believe in something. So this, I want to offer you some snippets of this idea that connects viruses and beliefs to the novel Snow Crash by Neal Stephenson. This is sort of an insertion into this talk of something that I was thinking about in the spring when I was thinking about coronavirus conspiracy theories and the idea that there's a conspiracy theory that 5G networks can give you coronavirus, which again seems like a very strange idea that a technology has this capacity to make you physically sick. And so when I mentioned this to my spouse, he said, "Oh, you have to read Snow Crash. That's like the first novel in which a computer virus makes people biologically ill." So I read Snow Crash, and it's I have to go back and read it again, but Snow Crash is super interesting. It's one of the first novels to fictionalize this idea that a computer virus can make people physically ill. The text explicitly links the computer virus with both language and religious belief. So I'm not going to discuss these quotations. I hope you've had a chance to read through them. The purpose here is to demonstrate how fiction has already mined some of this territory of the viral metaphor that sets a stage or prepares a context for how we think about and experiences viruses as biologically real, socially real, and also computationally real. So in these quotations, you see that there's this idea that language spreads, like language can spread ideas, especially religious ideas, like a virus. Then in the last quotation in the orange color, there's an argument actually that that religion, and especially Judaism, is an example of, like, religion is viral contagion, right? When you spread religious ideas, they spread like viruses. Super interesting idea. So this is my last slide and the last things I'm going to say. So the metaphoric joining of the social and the biological registers that are suggested by inoculation against misinformation, the corruption of vaccines, and the idea that religion and language spread like viruses demonstrates the complexity of vaccine dissent. Vaccine regimes are vulnerable in part because dissent from them tends to be treated as lack of acceptance of the authority of science, the result of wrong belief, and thus they are available for adjustment through education, acceptance of scientific authority, and deflection of concerns about historic wrongdoing. So that's actually a super complicated sentence that on reading, I think is not absolutely clear. So let me parse that out a little bit. So if vaccine dissent is treated as lack of acceptance of the authority of science and the result of wrong belief, then vaccine dissent is available for adjustment through education, the acceptance of scientific authority, and also the deflection of historic concerns about historic wrongdoing, because those happened in the past. We don't do them now. You shouldn't use those as a gauge for how you relate to science and medicine in the current context. I would argue we have to accept the complexity, the social complexity of vaccine dissent, as well as its heterogeneity, and try to understand the way in which social concerns overlay and mix with fears of biological danger, so that we may address vaccine dissent as a modern dilemma in which the desire to plan, control, manage, and prevent both illness and people's behaviors comes into conflict with people's desires to be autonomous, to have their own beliefs, to make their own calculations of risk and reward, to recognize, honor, and be guided by their own historical and community experiences, and to choose health practices that cohere with their worldview. So I'm going to stop this share now. That is the end of my prepared remarks. And I really look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Bernice. And I invite you to enter to the discussion and raise your questions. You can, of course, also write in the chat box that you can clearly come in. And anyone? If not, I would. If not at the moment, and I'm sure there will be later on, I would like to start with a question on to what extent the dilemmas nowadays are different than in the past. You mentioned a shift in the way we see in the vaccination debate, but can you really come back to that and raise the issue, discuss the issue again? Are we going to see a more mandatory, or you don't have, or you avoid the policy part and you focus on social construction of the issue? But the question now is probably mandatory yes or no, or which kind of sanctions and incentives, and how does it differ from the past?
So I think that's a really interesting question. And in some ways, I think that, so I think the way I would answer that is that for a long time, vaccine promoters would say things like, well, all these vaccine resistors, if we just have a pandemic, they're gonna all want to be vaccinated. Like a pandemic would create this kind of emergency situation that would demonstrate the necessity of vaccines. And I think what we've seen, I'm kind of unsure. What I started to see a few months ago is actually more empathy for people who are vaccine hesitant in the context of a pandemic. And that happened in the context of this articulation of empathy towards African American communities and their historical exploitation in medical research and in medical care. And so there was this initial kind of and there's a lot of effort in the United States towards reaching underserved communities, or at least a lot of discourse about how do you reach underserved communities, how do you address the mistrust of Black and Brown communities in the United States, so Hispanic communities, African American communities. What I'm not sure, because this is all like unfolding right now, and so it's kind of hard to figure out what that means in terms of where it's really going to land. Are we going to end up with more empathy in general towards concerns about vaccines? A lot of people are just concerned because the vaccines were developed so quickly and they use a new technology. That is normal historically to have those concerns. But at the same time, we have this incredibly polarized political situation where, where sort of people's behaviors are being judged peremptorily without kind of exploration about why people would, without kind of curiosity about why people believe the things they do, why they act the way they do. So I think there are these conflicting forces that that creating a situation, it's really hard to figure out what the end point is going to be. With respect to mandates, I think that there's, at least in the United States, my guess is that there will be efforts to mandate vaccination if we don't get to a certain level of vaccine acceptance at a time when there is a lot of vaccine available. Because the tendency now is to believe that people won't do the right thing, you just have to force them. And I personally think that would be politically dangerous, politically and socially dangerous, because mandates, if they're not, one time I have a friend at the CDC, and one of the things who works in the vaccine decision, and one thing she said was, you don't start out with the mandate. The mandate works really well when you're up to around 70% acceptance of a given vaccine. And the mandate helps you get to the 90% level where you really need to be with most vaccines for herd immunity. So I think that's one of the interesting questions is, are political actors and public health officials going to be patient and wait to see how the acceptance of the COVID vaccines works over time? Or is there going to be a sort of a decision that we can't wait, we have to make sure people are vaccinated? That's what I'm afraid of, because I think that would in the situation we're in the United States right now, I think that would actually create more social and political unrest than it would fix the situation of low vaccine acceptance. And so, that the other thing is, it's hard to imagine what kind of mechanism we would have. Now, I don't know. So in the United States, all of our vaccine mandates are for children and for school entry, or they're for the military. So there's no way to establish a widespread vaccine mandate for adults. There are no existing mechanisms, and so that would be something that would also sort of create a context in which it was very, very difficult to actually put that in motion.
Yeah. I wonder if others want to raise a question. I have few of them, but I also want to have other voices. I know Barbara has something to say, but I will wait with her. So maybe others. I will go on. We assume that we can win this fight against the COVID, against the pandemic, by vaccination. Not by testing, not by social distancing measures, not by medicines or something like this, but vaccination. But is it really realistic to expect us to win via vaccination? I'm asking this question because it may shed different light on all the vaccination mandatory question, yes or no. If we are losing anyway to variants of the COVID, then maybe even if we will try mandatory vaccination, we are not going to win. And you did research in the past, and I'm curious to hear what you think about it. Did you consider this aspect at all?
So, that what I would say is that there are that would be one argument of a sort of group of vaccine dissenters. So there's a couple different ways to think about that argument. One is that the virus is going to, this particular virus appears to have significant sort of tendency towards mutation, and especially if it's, really, really widespread. I mean, the vaccine argument would be that you can reduce the number of, if you can reduce the circulation of the virus, you're going to reduce the potential for for creation of these dangerous mutations, or just mutations that don't respond to the current vaccines. I think that from the perspective of vaccine resistors, some of them would sort of talk about the natural course of the viral mutations and the fact that vaccines are only going to they're only going to make that happen faster, potentially. They're going to use the analogy of antibiotic resistance to think through the question of viral mutation with vaccines. For me, I would say that the other thing I think of when you ask that question is there have been news reports that there has been so much effort on vaccination on vaccination that treatment approaches to treatment have been not as robust, and that given how widespread the virus is and how many people are still getting sick, and the numbers in the United States are, it's hard to even understand, to even kind of really kind of take in those numbers. But that many more people would have been saved if they had done a lot more work early on, focusing on treatment, which treatment is better now. They know more, but it still continues to be lesser, especially lung treatments to really kind of address those issues. So, and it's reminiscent of the arguments around HIV/AIDS and the focus on efforts to figure out a vaccine for HIV, which of course has still not been successful, and whether or not how the identifying the HIV. This is like sort of what Steve Epstein kind of talks about in Impure Science, the effort to identify the virus as the cause of AIDS and identify antiretroviral treatments, ignored other sorts of treatments for immune boosting and other things that were not immaterial to people's health. So I see a Karen. I wonder if you want to unmute yourself, Karen, and just ask the question out loud.
Sure. Thanks for this great talk. So I really like the idea of looking at misinformation as a frame, not only as a phenomenon, and one which might not be necessarily that useful. But I'm coming from a communication media perspective. I'm wondering if you have any ideas of what can be an alternative useful frame to discuss vaccination dissent.
So I've been thinking about the confidence frame, which is also the frame that is being used now by public health organizations. In other words, and which shifts that sort of response. So confidence suggests people don't have trust. And so so that's the frame that I'm thinking about with respect to this question. I have a short article on misinformation as a frame. It was published in the Journal on Education, which is an online journal. So you should, the article is called Against Misinformation. And so that has some more resources in it. I think that, so confidence gets at this question of trust. And I think that trust is really, you know, what for a long time, what we've had is the science is clear, vaccinations are safe, right? But that suggests that people who dissent from vaccines trust science and trust scientists. And that clearly, right, that gets back to the corruption metaphor, right? Clearly there's a breakdown in trust from certain groups in the population towards both sort of bureaucratic authorities, public health authorities of the state, and state-supported science that supports vaccinology. And so I think that so the misinformation frame suggests that it's the individual who is reviewing and thinking about sharing and promulgating this misinformation as the cause of the problem. But if misinformation is just a symptom of this larger question of trust, it's a more complicated problem to address in a way, but it's also shifts that authority. Who should address it? If I don't trust you, right? In some ways, it's your responsibility to gain my trust, or at least understand why I don't trust you. And so what's happened is that if you look at the debate is mired in this problem of people who are vaccine dissenters articulating various pseudoscientific arguments as to why vaccines are bad for people. And so scientists and public health people just say, well, those are crappy arguments. Those are terrible. Those are untrue. You're relying on bad science. But if you treat those arguments rhetorically rather than as facts, then you see that there's an attempt to argue in the science space, which has authority, and to sort of suggest that alternative scientific views can be utilized in this kind of argument space to push against mainstream science. But the real motivator for those arguments are values and beliefs and lack of trust. And so I think that's why the misinformation frame it's a classic modernist frame of trust and expertise and trust in strangers. The other thing that is interesting to think about in terms of misinformation, and I've been sort of playing around with this idea and I'm not quite sure what to do with it, is that, I mean, I have like a statement about it, but I don't know how to go further with it, I guess I'd say. So when somebody says vaccines are safe, what they mean is that the risk-benefit ratio at the level of the population suggests that the population benefits from getting the vaccine because there are fewer deaths or adverse consequences for the group that gets the vaccine than the group that gets sick or is exposed to the illness. But nobody experiences vaccine injury or vaccine reactions at the level of the population. You experience them personally through your own body. So the argument that vaccines are safe rings false when people have themselves experienced some form of vaccine injury or think they have experienced or their children have experienced some form of vaccine injury. This is also part of the misinformation frame because it means that there's these two different registers of perceiving risk and experiencing adverse consequences. So in the scientific public health argument that you're supposed to sort of, they're safe for the population, but there's really no way to determine whether or not they're going to be safe for any given individual. So even though the individual might only be at risk of 1 in a million, 1 in 2 million people are going to have an adverse reaction, the person who has that adverse reaction never experiences it at that level. They experience an N of 1. And so that's also a way in which this idea of misinformation around safety, you could think about it as it's a different way of thinking about safety and risk. It's not misinformed, it's just not scientific in the way that the scientists want us to experience that. And so I think that's another, I don't know what to do with this particular observation, but it feels like it's part of this bigger problem of the way we experience modernity's benefits of technological advancement, but we also kind of don't always adhere to the rationalities that are required by it.
Thank you. And Barbara, please, I know that you want to make a comment. Can you keep it short, please?
I don't know.
I will help you. I'm here to help.
Okay. In answer to your question about the mandatoriness of the vaccine, the current view in the States now is, as long as the vaccine is still acting under an emergency use authorization, nobody's going to make it mandatory. So we won't see it being mandatory for a long while. Having said that, New York State has introduced a bill to make it mandatory. I don't think it'll go anyplace, but it's sitting on the books. In terms of adult vaccination, in 2019, in April, New York City enacted a public health order making it mandatory for anyone, adults included, to appear in public if they hadn't had the measles vaccine, and imposed a fine of $1,000. And it worked. And they went to court, the anti-vaxxers went to court on it, and they lost. Now, having said that, in Rockland County, they tried to introduce a similar law. That one focused on children, and that one failed. So as the vaccine gains scientific validity, which it has a long way to go, we will see some push to get it, as long as there's a need for it. If there isn't a need, nobody's going to push it. Nobody wants to. The public health experts are saying, as Bernice was saying, well, try to convince people. Nobody wants to say, go out and do it. But having said that, in the past, when we faced major epidemics, it was forced. The thing that's new and different is the organization of the anti-vax groups. And so when Bernice was talking about the Blacks and the fear, those fears were seeded back in the summertime by Del Bigtree, by Robert Kennedy, going on the press saying, we're going to start this Tuskegee Association. The Blacks are the tested group. Now, this follows a pattern that the anti-vax groups have used, both in the Somali in Minnesota and in the ultra-Orthodox groups in Brooklyn, in Rockland, and even here, about all of the horrible things that are going to affect insular groups. So you have an anti-vax group that's much, much more virulent now, to use a bad metaphor, and that has access not just to social media and websites, but the bots that routinely use it. Now, there have been reports that the Russians have co-opted the bots, and the Russians are spreading vaccine misinformation. And so you have to look at two types of misinformation. One, the innocent kind, that people are just saying things because they don't know any better, and the deliberate, active framing and attempts to manipulate. And if you want to see a very good manipulation, look at the RFK website, where he has a debate with Alan Dershowitz, not a stupid person, and he basically convinces Alan Dershowitz that smallpox did not eradicate smallpox and polio. And he does it by misstating data, by taking articles and saying it says one thing and not another, and all sorts of things that you could never do in a court of law, but on a website you can. So that's what's new and different, and it impacts on communication. Now, just to get to communication. There was an article this week in TiGRE in the in the website of the CDC on Journal of Emerging Diseases on communication techniques, and two communication researchers, Drs. Emily Vraga and Letitia Bodes, did an experiment where they tried to use social media to try and change attitudes. And they looked at two kinds of attitudes with COVID, one a scientific one, and one related to preventing disease, and that is, do hot baths work to prevent COVID? And they were successful in detoxifying the hot baths, raise your body temperature part of it. They got the people to believe that, but the people who wanted to believe the hot baths prevent COVID, even though the science underpinning it, they detoxified, stayed with the belief. So you might want to look that out.
So thanks
Thank
for
you.
those comments. The one thing out of those really kind of rich comments that I would want to kind of respond to is the notion that various groups in the United States become anti-vax because ideological anti-vaxxers convince them, come in and manipulate them. Now, I'm not arguing that ideological anti-vaxxers don't do that. That there's a really, really interesting document that was produced for the Orthodox communities, an anti-vax document it's from a group called PEACH, and I can't remember what the acronym stands for, but it's really a fascinating pamphlet because it's created for a community that doesn't use the internet, right? Which, think about that, like that's a really interesting, like in one document, it includes like all the possible vaccine dissenting arguments that you could include. And in the back, it has a set of phone numbers you can call to get recorded messages about vaccines. And this was utilized in those ultra-Orthodox communities in New York during the measles that, kind of seeded certain kinds of anti-vax views. However, for example, with the Somali immigrants, this was a case in Minnesota in 2017 when I think it was 2017, there was an outbreak of measles in the Somali immigrant community. There was work done by the anti-vax groups up there to kind of proselytize. But I have a former student who did a study up there, and there were ideas indigenous to that group that had to do with their perceptions of the United States and the nutrition and the lifestyle of their children that led them to believe that the vaccines were dangerous to their children in certain ways that were not motivated or pushed by anti-vax ideologues. And so I would caution to sort of, so let me say it this way. In the United States, there has not been very much attention paid at all until this last year towards African-American mistrust of medicine because of historic racist incidents in medicine and medical research. And the fact that that's being paid attention to now is quite remarkable. There was not a lot of attention paid to vaccine concerns in communities of color at all. In fact, the notion was that vaccine concerns were created by white middle-class mothers who are concerned about things that are going into their children, that their children are getting autism. That very narrow view itself is a problem. It was produced by the media over the course of a number of years. Elena Conis's book, Vaccine Nation, argues this. I argue this, that the media reporting on vaccine dissent consolidated around the problem of the sort of misbelieving middle-class white mother in that period between 2000 and 2010. And then, and there are many sort of gendered implications to that, that the problem of the educated white middle-class mother who should know better and yet still resists vaccination. What that did was it meant that there wasn't a lot of attention paid at all to mothers of color and their vaccine concerns. And so I think we still have a situation in which vaccine concerns are not taken seriously as having substance because they are framed as wrong, anti-science, manipulative, and the product of a sort of gullibility to internet sharing of information. So I think it's a hard thing to figure out, like, how do we understand the work of these clearly manipulative, disinforming figures like Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Del Bigtree, in some ways Barbara Loie Fisher, Barbara Tenpenny. How do we understand their work to try to sow distrust in vaccines overall and their manipulation of the COVID scenario in order to do that? And at the same time, not treat vaccine concerns as stupid, irrational, wacko, and without substance. Because what my work has found is that when you treat them as having substance, not necessarily agreeing with them, but you try to explore what they mean, you find this really, really rich set of ideas about discomfort that some people have with our world, with the way that medicine treats illness, and the way that we understand the human body to work in relationship to other bodies. And those are the ways you can only do that by kind of entering into the discourse and trying to understand what's going on. And so I think I keep trying to kind of balance this problem of the sort of manipulative, disinforming influence and its dangerous elements, but also trying to honor the concerns of people, because it's only by honoring them and treating them without like automatically just sort of dismissing them that you can that we can understand what is actually going on at a kind of more philosophical level concerning vaccines and concerns. So that's the way that I sort of I'm stuck in that problem, right?
So let me ask you a question that outside from the vaccine controversies, to what extent this controversy is different and similar to other controversies about modernity, from the book till closer to your things that you are dealing with, it breastfeeding or abortion, etc. So do they all share the same lines, the same ideas, the same debates?
Well, so if we compare it to breastfeeding, it's actually pretty interesting. In breastfeeding, you know, there is this kind of discourse in medicine that, you know, supports, there's a sort of, in obstetrics and in pediatrics, that supports breastfeeding as the best way to feed children. But there's also this incredibly strong, and I would be interested to know in Israel if it's the same, but in the United States, incredibly strong idea that you cannot ever make a mother feel guilty about the way she feeds her child. And therefore there is a refusal to acknowledge that in feeding with infant formula is in fact nutritionally and relationally inferior to breastfeeding, right? So that, at least when I was doing the research on breastfeeding, that was this kind of persistent view. So in other words, there was a view that you could ignore the scientific research on how important breastfeeding is, both relationally and nutritionally and immunologically to infants and children, because socially it was really impossible for mothers often to accomplish breastfeeding. But you kind of have the opposite problem with vaccination, right? In fact, if I would argue there may be some social limits to how many vaccines, for example, we're willing to accept for children. And yet the argument is that any concerns that parents have are anti-scientific and therefore have to be repudiated by public health officials. So what that suggests to me is that there's like this underlying actual social context, which is more important than the scientific evidence in both cases, and then sort of figuring out what that is and understanding it. So that's the way I would start to understand that question. The other thing I'm working on with respect to this issue is the question of planning. I'm really interested in this notion of planning as an aspect of modernity, that we plan, control, and manage our lives rationally. And so activities and behaviors that are difficult to plan for, difficult to schedule, difficult to manage, like illness, right, which kind of breaks into your life and kind of upsets the daily routines that are so important to living in modern societies. Like that, you know, when your kid gets sick and you have to stay home with them and miss, you know, like it's like this problem, right? In addition, breastfeeding, of course, is a largely non-scheduled use of the maternal body that is extremely it can be haphazard and difficult. Your body is leaking, your body doesn't, you know, it's difficult. So this notion of planning and control and rationalization is also a similar theme.
Yeah, fascinating. Let me just say thank you very much. It was enlightening presentation, and my understanding of your views and your research now opened a new way of thinking about those issues for me as a regulation scholar, public policy scholar. And I hope it will be fruitful for my own research. And I thank you for that very much.
Well,
And
thank you for the opportunity. It's been great.
Yeah, thank you very much, Bernice, and good evening to everyone. I'm sure it's late here. It's 8 o'clock in Israel, and I think in Europe in general. So have a good day, good afternoon, Bernice. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.